It's really a pleasure to be here at the Texas Heart Institute Perfusion Conference. For the last 5 years, the AMSEC History Committee has been collecting material related to the history of our field. And Napoleon once said that, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" Thomas Carlyle, a few years later, said that biography is the only true history. I like the second suggestion better than Napoleon's. So one rich source for the history of cardiovascular perfusion is contained in its newsletters. In the next several minutes, I'd like to share with you some of those newsletters that really trace the whole history of the field. These are the three sources of the material that I'm going to present today. Newsletters, as you all know, are not peer-reviewed, but they do provide a forum for conveying information to society members. AMSEC News was the very first one, and it was published from 1967 to 1983. It was quarterly in the early years and then became monthly. Perfusion Life, which was a much maligned name, people referred to it as Boy's Life, was started in 1984 and ran for about 11 years. And it was in a magazine format. It was actually published, I believe, 11 times a year. And most recently, the last iteration has been AMSEC Today, which was published beginning in 1996. And in September 2003, it went online only, and it's published quarterly. So this is the very first AMSEC newsletter that I could find, and it's dated December 1967. That's a year before AMSEC was even formally incorporated in Minnesota as a society. The group of perfusionists, primarily from Minneapolis and the Midwest, got together in 1964 and founded a small group to exchange ideas, and that was really the beginnings of AMSEC. James Wade was the president in 1967, and among the items that were referred to in this newsletter was the suggestion that members buy a little pin identifying themselves as members of AMSEC. Committee work was also described, including efforts to establish certification. Now, as you may know, AMSEC in the early years was composed of cardiopulmonary technicians as well as dialysis technicians. The plan for the certification process was to collect questions for an examination that was to be given in 1969 at the Detroit conference. Well, they kind of missed that mark because the first exam was not given until the early 1970s. The questions that were collected were to be then submitted to the AMSEC Medical Advisory Board, which the goal was to, quote, assure worldwide recognition of technicians, end quote. The secretary of AMSEC in those early years was Rose Latourie. She was the chief perfusionist at the Cleveland Clinic. And Guy Prater from Dallas, Texas, Guy's an old friend from many years ago, was the newsletter editor. And as a curiosity, in this very first newsletter, they said that, well, the meeting's going to be in San Francisco at the Jack Tar Hotel, and you can sign up and get a room for $16 a night. So that's really shows how things have changed in the last 50 years or so. Now, one of the important tasks in the 1970s was to decide what perfusionists were to be called. This necessity was mandated when making application to the American Medical Association to gain recognition for a new allied health occupation. Prior to that, several titles had been used for those who operated heart-lung machines. These included perfusion technologist, perfusionist, perfusion technician, pump technician, or the more familiar pump tech. I was called a pump tech for years by Dr. Ahrens down at UTMB, or extracorporeal technologist, or even extracorporeal perfusionist. So there's a whole mishmash of titles that were used. At Hershey Medical Center, where I was trained on the job in 1972, we were referred to as extracorporeal circulation technologist. Well, that was a real mouthful, and that gave way to simply being called perfusionists. So a job description was finally agreed upon at the AMSEC conference in Portland in 1975. It was as follows, quote, "A perfusion technologist is an individual who operates a heart-lung machine required for total or partial cardiopulmonary bypass for surgical correction of various types of cardiac defects and surgical repair of diseases of the heart and abnormalities of the great vessels," end quote. The scope of duties cited the need for perfusionists to have advanced knowledge and specialized study, and quote, "whereby the technologist can quickly recognize and instantaneously react to correct innumerable problems which may develop within the extracorporeal circuit, whether related to difficulties with the patient's condition or the surgical operation itself or with the equipment," end quote. Other duties included administration on prescription of anesthetic agents such as halothane and other common drugs that we use every day. The description ended with the statement, quote, "Final legal and medical responsibility for extracorporeal perfusion rests with the physician," end quote. I can almost guarantee you that Charlie Reed, who was president of AMSEC at the time that the job description was published, was responsible for that statement. Now, ethics was another subject that figured very prominently in the early newsletters. In fact, a proposed AMSEC Code of Ethics for ethical conduct was published in September 1970. The preamble stated that the standard was, quote, "the right reason and was intended to aid technologists in the maintenance of a high level of professional and personal ethics," end quote. There were 4 sections and 12 tenets. And this is the first code of ethical conduct published by AMSEC. It appeared in October 1973, and it had several tenets that talked about continuing education, team support, and respect for the patient's privacy, dignity, and safety. Other tenets addressed upholding the dignity and honor of the profession, the need for keeping accurate records, and for perfusionists to have an understanding to be able, once again, to react to all types of emergencies, whether medical or mechanical. 3 years later, the number of tenets in the code had been reduced to 9, and a revised code was published that addressed the issue of conflict of interest for perfusionists who sold or received commissions for use of cardiopulmonary equipment. Consultation by a perfusionist was considered allowable so long as the fees were commensurate with what was the services that were being rendered, and it was not in conflict with the perfusionist employer. By 1992, the AMSEC Code of Ethics had been reduced yet again, this time to 7 so-called canons with interpretive statements, and a detailed procedure for handling ethical complaints was published in that newsletter in 1992. Deborah Pacheco was chair of the ethics committee and put in a great amount of work to bring that to the members of AMSEC. Now, as previously mentioned, establishment of certification was an early goal of AMSECT. And remember, again, dialysis technicians and perfusionists were members of AMSECT in the late 60s and early 70s. In the September 1971 issue of the newsletter, certification was touted as a reality. The Committee for Certification and Education, chaired by Jim Deering, developed a set of proposed requirements for candidates to become certified. Among these was development of a written examination, which was then to be reviewed by the AMSECT Medical Advisory Board. Eligibility to take the exam consisted of having 1 year's experience in 50 clinical cases. For perfusionists, for the dialysis technicians, 25 clinical cases, and somewhat surprisingly, 2 years of experience. Candidates also had to have a letter from one of the physicians at their institution attesting to the fact that this person, in fact, did have experience and was functioning as a perfusionist or a dialysis technician. The final requirement was that the candidate had to be a member in good standing of AMSECT. Excuse me. Now, one little known fact was that the original AMSECT Medical Advisory Board was composed of physicians who were members of the American Society of Artificial Internal Organs, since ASIO was dominated by cardiac surgeons and nephrologists. Those appointed by ASIO to review questions for the AMSECT certification exam were Drs. E. Converse Pierce II for heart-lung technology and Dr. Charles F. Gooch for dialysis. Questions for the exam were compiled by Jim Deering and Dietz Van Dura. Other notable physicians who were on the medical advisory board were Richard A. DeWall, Adrian Kantrowitz, Pierre Galletti, and Willem Koff. This photo shows them sitting at the table at the ASIO conference in Seattle in 1972 to discuss plans for the AMSECT certification exam. Excuse me. Now, this is another photo taken the same day at that meeting, and you can see right to left a very young Jim Deering. On the right, Catherine Hargesheimer and Jerry Dobbs are also shown, along with Pierre Galletti and some of the other folks that were helping to develop this exam. Well, the affiliation with ASIO really never gained traction. And in 1975, AMSECT sought to enlist the help of surgeons from both thoracic surgery societies. Cardiac surgeon Dr. Arthur Bell Jr. from Houston was the primary liaison in this effort. In 1977, because of these efforts, the American Medical Association formally recognized the extracorporeal technologist, which was once again soon replaced by the word clinical perfusionist. This major event occurred during the tenure of President Leroy Ferris, and he reported on this at the 1978 AMSECT conference that was held in San Diego. And one of the early tasks after gaining recognition from the AMA was to draft some so-called essentials, which was a document to specify minimum standards for training programs. This is an insert that was included in one of the newsletters circa 1975. It's a 2-page document. I know you won't be able to read all of it, but it goes into great detail regarding what were the standards for training programs that were to be accredited. There were several sections dealing with organization, clinical affiliation, facilities, faculty, students, and curriculum. Importantly, the AMSECT Board of Directors and the American Board of Cardiovascular Perfusion Technology. How many of you know that the original name of the American Board of Cardiovascular Perfusion had the word technology appended to the end of it. But that was the situation in 1974. Both organizations, AMSEC and the American Board, endorsed this statement. And interestingly, another little factoid as I read through the documents was that the minimum caseload requirement for perfusionists consisted of performing only 12 cases per year, but that was later, of course, changed to 40 cases per year. Now, AMSEC conducted several surveys over the years, almost 20, in fact, and the results were published in their newsletters. Some had to do with salaries, membership needs, job duties and satisfaction, manpower, government relations, and strategic planning. One of the results of these surveys was the very first pre-bypass perfusion checklist shown here. This was published in 1990. You'll notice it's titled Suggested Pre-Bypass Checklist. It was the product of the Perfusion Quality Committee. Beverly Perrault was the chair of that committee. And it was subsequently modified in 2004 to include emergent restart of bypass, termination, post-bypass. And that was published again 14 years after this original one appeared. A so-called essentials document specifying the scope of perfusion practice was published in 1992. This was followed by the first comprehensive guidelines for the conduct of extracorporeal circulation published in 1995, and then guidelines for pediatric perfusion practice published in 2004. So once again, all of these efforts to publish standards were the result of volunteers who served time on the committee to generate these documents. And as you may know, the current standard that's published on the AMSEC website is based on evidence-based medicine, which again has been endorsed by all the disciplines involved in cardiac surgery. Now, going backwards just a few years, in 1977, this was the very first standard of practice document that I could find. It was specifying what should be on a perfusion record. The chair of the committee at the time was Aaron Hill. He was assisted by Richard Berryessa, Jim Deering, Jeannie Lang, and Emily Taylor. And they generated this document saying, look, this is what you ought to be recording on a perfusion record that will become a permanent part of the patient's chart. The preamble stated it had been approved by the AMSEC Board of Directors, but apparently that approval was rescinded because some of the perfusionists in the field thought that it was too restrictive and would be dictating clinical practice. So again, another sort of factoid that not many people are aware of. Now, how many of you know what is represented on the AMSEC emblem? AMSEC historian and former president Matty Massengale researched and reported on the composition of the AMSEC logo. Surprisingly, this logo was created by 4 Canadians: Ian Ross, Roger Sampson, Jacques Lussier, and Pierre Morin. Canadian perfusionists were actually a part of AMSEC back in the early years. And the perfusionists, or the technicians that designed this, wanted to incorporate perfusion and dialysis. So what you see on the left is a stylized oxygenator, a roller pump in the lower right. The little circle with the arrow represents man, and then there's a finger pump to the right beneath a coiled spiral coil dialysis cartridge. Well, as you might expect, a lot of the articles in these AMSEC newsletters are based on people who were doing things for the society. Once again, the AMSEC History Committee is trying to archive all that material and record what was done. Nearly 1/3 of the newsletters, and I've collected nearly 300, have to do with people, interviews, and reminiscences. So when one looks at all the newsletters in toto, it's apparent that many perfusionists volunteered their time, and that tradition certainly is being carried forward by today's volunteers. 1989, Maddie Massengale, the AMSECT historian, reported on those early efforts to achieve recognition. And she noted that in the early years, virtually all perfusionists were trained on the job. But with the recognition by the AMA, accredited programs rose from 2 in 1981 to 20 by the time she published her article in 1989. She also recounted controversies over the so-called manpower shortage in the 1980s in response to cabbage operations. Sadly, 38 articles in the newsletters have reported paying tribute to those who passed on. Some were well-known, some lesser known, but all practicing perfusionists. So in terms of today's presentation, because of time restraints, I've not been able to present everything that's represented in all these newsletters, but there are other topics such as education, international news, practice trends, and of course, AMSECT officers and committee chairs represented in the newsletters. So in closing, it's been an exercise to categorize and annotate newsletter articles, and it's been a remarkable walk down memory lane, and I hope you've enjoyed the walk with me today. Thank you very much.